Listening does require a certain level of humility. We've actually got to deal with the foundational belief system, which is white supremacy and racism. Because if we don't deal with those two things, we won't be able to deal with this disposability that then is projected onto ecological spaces and to whole peoples. And so the ability to maintain our revolutionary imagination, our liberatory imagination, and spirit of optimism is key.
Hello, welcome to this week's show. A huge thank you to all of you who came to my book launch event. It was very sweet, sacred, and intimate. We had some hauntingly beautiful musical performances from Tess Amadeo Vickery and Ash Bradford, as well as some personal intimate sharings and celebration. You can receive the video of this beautiful occasion along with some other gifts if you go to www.amisha.co.uk/intuition. One of the gifts that I'm also sharing there is the printed out version of the extra chapter that I wrote just for the audiobook called Playing in the Wild Fields of Trust, which shares a lot of my personal story and my relationship with cultivating my intuition. The book, Intuition, Access Your Inner Wisdom, Trust Your Instincts, Find Your Path, is now available in the UK and Australia, and available for pre-order in the US and Canada. Alan Clements, who has been a guest on this podcast and is author of A Future to Believe in, Instinct for Freedom, and The Voice of Hope, shared that this book is one of the most essential new books on the planet today. Both timely and courageous, it offers intimate and informed guidance in learning to hear one's finest inner voices, and moreover, summoning the bravery to first trust, then act on behalf of one's truth for the betterment of both self and other, life itself. A true visionary accomplishment by a beautiful mind. Spread the word and gift this gem to friends. Please do support authors, independent bookstores, and of course, authors of colour. And as we are coming to the end of the year and the end of the beautiful leadership immersion, we wanted to let you know that both this program and the Presence one-to-one leadership mentoring is opening up in mid-January for the next cohort for this powerful adventure. You can find out more about that if you go to www.thefutureisbeautiful.co/courses. My guest this week is Hop Hopkins, the Director of Strategic Partnerships for the Sierra Club, where he works to ensure that Sierra Club campaigns and programs protect those most affected by climate change and environmental degradation, and promote economic justice. Born in Dallas, Texas, to working-class parents, Hop sharpened his intersectional analysis, organizing as a HIV and AIDS organizer and anti-globalization activist during the WTO uprising. In the years since, he has worked in the labor movement, the climate justice movement, and the housing justice movement. Hop is also a certified arborist, a master gardener, has his permaculture design certificate, and is a certified community emergency response team instructor. Hop works in his community outside of Los Angeles to create a network of residual food forests in order to support the development of stable, human-scale, solar self-reliant neighborhood communities integrated with cooperative local economies. Alongside his wife of 17 years, Hop homeschools their 2 children and maintains a food forest inhabited by their pet Australian shepherds, chickens, honeybees, fruit trees, and multiple compost piles. This podcast episode is the finale of a series of 8 conversations called Listening to Each Other, Listening to Earth. This series is a collaboration with St. Ethelburga's Centre for Reconciliation and Peace in London and funded by the Calliopeia Foundation. St. Ethelburga's builds community resilience for times of ecological and social emergency through practical collaborative action. They aspire to courageously face the realities of the landscape we are in, whilst also holding a vision for regeneration for a just and inclusive world, rooted in care for each other and our common home. Their work is organised around 4 principles, which are put values into action, seek opportunity in crisis, build community across differences, and protect what is sacred. Listening to each other, listening to Earth, reaches for the place where spiritual ecology and climate justice meet. It explores the integration of spirituality with grounded action through the lives and leadership of people of colour. In this conversation, called Ecology of Listening, we explore the themes of humility, climate justice, and liberatory imagination as we contemplate the question, how do we create pathways into living our full humanity? We hope that you enjoy this episode and that it opens up deeper capacity within to listen and to live the solidarity and the leadership this time calls for. Welcome to The Future is Beautiful, with me, your host, Amisha Gadiali. On this show, we explore the weave between politics, spirituality, creativity, and sustainability. It's time for us to move beyond silos and into an integrated way of being. Every one of us has ideas and personal experiences to share that can lead us to a brighter future. This is the revolution. Despite the challenges we face as a global community or the pressures that we meet in our daily lives, when we stop and dare to dream, to ask ourselves the big questions, and to share what we are already doing, we create the future that we wish to wake up for. That future is beautiful. I am absolutely delighted, Hop, to welcome you to The Future is Beautiful, and that we have carved out this time to share and connect in this final month of a very full year.
Yeah, some would say a dumpster fire.
A dumpster fire.
Yeah. Of a year.
What is this question? What is this phrase, listening to each other, listening to Earth, mean to you?
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure as well to be here. And I think that question is asking multiple questions. One of the questions is, are we even at a pace where we can recognize the messages that are being given to us by our bodies, by each other, and by the environment ecosystem around us? To be alive in this world today means that everything's happening very quickly, in rapid succession, and really to be in tune and in touch with folks, you really have to slow down and disconnect and divorce yourself from that invitation to be at breakneck speed all the time, and to sit quietly. And in our homeschool work and the outdoor education that we do, we practice what we call a sit spot. And we invite our students and participants to find a small patch of dirt or grass or gravel or what have you, and to just sit quietly and to think about what the earth feels like on your body, what it feels like to just sit and listen to and try to get in tune with your voice, to sit and listen to what actually is happening around you. Is it warm? Is it cold? Is there a breeze? Are there birds chirping? Are there squirrels dropping nuts from trees? Is there a plane going overhead? Can you hear traffic? And to really begin to take note of the things that in your everyday going on you don't recognize. And in the same way, we invite folks to be in relationship with each other that way. When someone stops you and asks how you're doing, or, for example, what we did before launching into what some might see as a transactional activity of being in a conversation with each other, really to sit and to invite ourselves to be open to the things that may be happening in our subconscious, or maybe right at the forefront of our mind, but to put them in the proper perspective and place, given the situation and what the moment calls for. I think as someone who sees himself as an ecologist, when we move into a different environment, That's one of the first things we want to do, even if we're being called in because there is a quote unquote problem. But if you try to address that problem in isolation of the entire situation that it operates in, you're liable to misdiagnose or misassess what is actually happening and apply remedy or a process that might actually not be the one that that system is calling for because you haven't taken the moment to look at it in a holistic fashion. You've compartmentalized the issue. And of course, we know that that's not true. And so when you're in conversation with someone and with yourself, you're oftentimes holding what might often seem like contradictory ideas. And in this moment, I mentioned 2020 might seem like a dumpster fire. And that might be one perspective for some folks. And other folks, they completely feel like it's been exactly what they wanted. And we have to hold those realities we have to co-hold those realities at the same time and recognize that both of those things are challenging, could be challenging by themselves and even that more challenging together. And it doesn't necessarily mean that neither one of them is incorrect. We interface with the environment, we interface with each other. I think it's recognizing that you're going to be presented with a number of facts in which to interpret. Some of that interpretation is going to depend on what your experiences have been, on what your imagination allows it to be. I try to co-hold all of those things when I'm visiting a new place or when I'm meeting someone new, or even when I'm visiting an old place or interacting with someone who I've known for many years, because I oftentimes know that situations don't always allow us to explore in depth the way we would normally if we were paying more attention. So to be very attentive to that reality is to then try to go deeper in my experiences on the day to day. And that's not always easy. And I don't always succeed.
Yeah, I feel that. And what about listening to Earth, like within our everyday action and living and work?
Yeah. Again, I think that that's a practice that's learned over time. I think when we come into this world, we are profound listeners because of our inability to verbalize speech initially. But we are speaking all the time. We're speaking through our eyes, we're speaking through our body language, we're speaking through the way in which we reach out for a finger and a baby grabs it for a sense of security or feeling. I think it's the same thing when we move into the environment where we're listening. And I think we're in this situation with climate change because we actually haven't been listening effectively to the planet. I think that the planet has been sending us signals about the level of engagement that we've been involved in and the level of change that we're creating and causing. Some of us have chosen to move forward without paying attention. And because of that, all of us now are forced to hear the messages that are coming, and we're experiencing them in lots of different ways. In a lot of ways, we're experiencing nature through our economic systems. And we can see that right now as we're living through COVID and the second, at least for the US and probably the globe, largest economic depression decline that we've seen. Listening does require a certain level of humility to know that what you're hearing you can't control. What you might think may need to happen in order to move beyond the message you're hearing may not be in your control either. You may also continue to be a passenger in that ride. So I think a lot of patience, a lot of humility, and recognizing that there may not be a clear way forward.
Can you share what you see or what you hear as we're talking about listening in this relationship between climate change, COVID, and the economy?
I think they're very much interlinked with one another, very related. As I wrote in my article, Racism is Killing the Planet, I tried to put them into context and not see them as compartmentalized and pulled apart and separated as we'd like to see them. For example, in racism and white supremacy, oftentimes we look at individual acts as opposed to the larger systemic nature of the overarching system of dominance and control that's represented. And by doing that and looking at individuals, we can come up with solutions or analysis to a problem like, oh, that's just one bad apple in the case of police brutality. if we pull apart that behavior from the actual system that allows that behavior to happen and that scales that behavior across departments, across states, will then oftentimes be allowed to come up with, oh, that's just one person in the system. It's not the overarching system by which that person or individual finds themselves in. And that system is not part of a larger system that predicates its foundation on dehumanization and colonization of whole peoples and the planet to such a degree that now we're forced with environmental degradation at a level that's much larger than anyone can escape. So, and what do I mean by that? If we move from that individual place that I spoke about to a specific geography, a sacrifice zone that's been given over to fossil fuel extraction, well, if we isolate that and not think about that, we could miss the cumulative impact that we're now faced with. Whereas before, it was easy to dehumanize those folks that lived in that place where that extraction was happening, to not think about the ecological impacts in that one spot that the extraction was happening, and to see those impacts as being very localized and static and stationary. But of course, we know that when polluted air doesn't stay just over the community in which the pollution's happening, we know that polluted water doesn't just run and stay committed to the stream that the point of impact has happened. It flows downstream. It flows out to the ocean. That ocean continues to move those pollutants to other places. We're now seeing this related to climate change in such a way that these smaller, localized impacts are now on a global nature, that they've exponentially grown, that there's been so much of this dehumanization that's happened in these smaller places that now there's no one can escape, and no place that's void of some level of toxic accumulation based on what's happened in other areas where they have nothing to do with.
And I really liked how in this article you really brought alive this notion that's been a part of global culture for a very long time, of those that are disposable. Can you share more about that?
I alluded to earlier sacrifice zones. Where do we get that from? And it's, for me, it was really important as an intervention in the environmental movement to really try to develop a broader understanding of exactly how environmental exploitation was very much related to the exploitation on a human level, that one begets the other. And it's through this contract that early on was created about the use of land and this doctrine of discovery that allowed early explorers to then be sent out around the globe to discover and take places that were already inhabited. And because these folks weren't Christian, it allowed them to see them as less human than themselves. That began a whole historical context to be set around discovering land and discovering people that could be exploited for financial gain. And in the article, I tried to lay this out in an historical context so that we could see that because we have allowed this thinking to persist to this day, that we have parts of the planet that are inhabitable because the people that were inhabiting those places were seen as less than. That allowed a certain racist mindset to set in. That disposability, again, allowed for certain environmental practices to take root in those communities. And we're at such a scale right now that to come back to do anything different than what we've got, we've actually got to deal with the foundational belief system, which is white supremacy and racism. Because if we don't deal with those two things, we won't be able to deal with disposability that then is projected onto ecological spaces and to whole peoples.
And how do we begin to really dismantle these foundations? I mean, a lot of the explorations that I've been part of this year since the uprisings in May has been focused around the inner work. And so there's been a lot of resources around books, teachers that can help people dismantle white supremacy in themselves, that can help people understand it within themselves. And I do understand that the relationship between what we understand in ourselves and how that then impacts systemic change. And yet I see its limits, right? Because, of course, to actually get to the people that are currently in that disposable category, in those sacrifice grounds right now, and to actually get to where the control is in the system. A lot of the folks that are reading these books about white supremacy are not in those spaces. How do we really dismantle this system, or begin to?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's something I've spent the greater part of my life trying to professionally and just as a human being dismantle. And I stand on the shoulders of many of those who've come before us in that long trajectory of folks who are trying to address white supremacy and systemic racism. And as I was trying to explain earlier, this belief system that has given us climate change has allowed for this belief in sacrifice zones. But those aren't possible without disposable people, and you can't have disposable people without racism. And then how do you then get rid of that racism? For many of the folks that it becomes an academic, and I think what you're asking is how does it become less of an academic practice and more of a material practice in the world in which we live, given that not everyone has the same power and privilege in the world, and actually that for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, racism is not a problem that we can solve alone. This is a problem and a belief system that BIPOC folks weren't the creators of. It also requires a certain level of understanding that it isn't just a one-way impact that happens. That many folks, when I ask folks, well, why do you believe we need to develop an anti-racist analysis? They'll say, well, I want to help to make sure that those injustices don't happen anymore. I want to make sure that there's not another police murdering of a Black young man or woman. And I said, okay, that's all good, but how does white supremacy impact you as a white person? And oftentimes, colleagues or friends, family members who are white don't have a response to that. And so I think part of the first piece of this is really getting a holistic approach of exactly what the ideology of white supremacy does, because it just doesn't dehumanize the victim. It also dehumanizes the person perpetrating the harm. And that's one of the first things that I think that most folks who identify as white miss, that there is a personal price, an interpersonal price to be paid by subscribing to white supremacy, by not resisting it, because it's an operation 24/7, just like the air that we breathe. And if we're not constantly acting and organizing against it, it's actively reacting and organizing us into that belief system, just as patriarchy and heterosexism is constantly organizing us into those belief systems. That for me is one of the first key steps in recognizing that this is a problem, that it's going to take active participation from all of us. And that participation is going to look different based on your relationship and your racialization in the current world that we live in. And I think for BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, we have a number of different impacts on it. It's not the internalized superiority that we are living with the centuries of this belief system. It's actually the internalized inferiority that we're dealing with, that we actually have to combat, that we actually have to resist. That also keeps us from knowing ourselves and being in deeper solidarity and relationship with folks in our own community. And it keeps us and prevents us from being in deeper solidarity and partnership with folks who don't share our racial identity, but are racialized as well. That may seem like a non-answer, but I actually think that that's a key foundational approach to actually recognizing the depth and the magnitude of the problem. We can go to the systems place where it then becomes practice, and it becomes law, and it gets practice in our police and in our judicial systems, and it gets practice in our financial systems in terms of loans and things like that.
Yeah, I'm really interested in this because I feel like we have a lot of white people in our community here listening. And over this year, we've had a lot of conversations around race and white supremacy and the process of the inner dismantling. And then what I see again and again is then the disconnect, and it might even be people that are talking about the importance of dismantling white supremacy. And then when it comes to making a decision in their business or their organization, white supremacy all over again.
Yes.
Because that's the system, right? That might be the culture of the organization or the culture of the business. Even when the individual humans have been doing that work and really taking that seriously and honoring the importance of it, and that this is a system that doesn't serve us. And then yet getting completely played by it again when it comes to making decisions on that organizational or professional level. And I would love to hear, what you can share with us around that. And then also the next level of when we get into the judicial and the police and these systems. And I know that these, by the way, are impossible questions.
Sure. Yeah, I'll be delivering the answer today on this podcast for sure, in this conversation. That's not going to happen. But I can offer you a perspective on, the work I do here at the Sierra Club, which is in the U.S. largest and oldest environmental organization in the country.
4 million members.
Yeah. Just under, probably 4 million members now, slightly under 4 million members. And we've been around for 128 years. Our organization has played a key role in what the modern environmental movement looks like today. The majority of our members are white, middle class, educated, and white. And so we're in the midst of a deep organization transformation. I think many organizations now, as a result of the world in which we're living in right now, with the resurgence of white supremacy at the head of the United States in the form of the president, we're living through the second largest human rights, civil rights movement, and the movement for Black lives, really calling into question, what does it mean to see folks as human? What does it mean to see Black people as fully human in all facets, and particularly in this case, in the fact that in the way in which our police and judicial system operate. So this piece I talked about previously about getting to a place of understanding that white supremacy isn't just something that people of color are impacted by, but it's also something that dehumanizes white people. And for those white folks who are trying to live into a new reality, it's very challenging. This world has not offered very many examples of what that might look like. And so it requires one to step out into their growing edge to recognize the solutions won't look or feel like, taste like, sound like anything that they've experienced before. This ideology also breeds a certain level of scarcity, because I think where people mostly go to is, when we talk about power and privilege, people oftentimes think about, well, I have to give something up in order for other folks to have what they need. And that thinking is a clear block to thinking about how unearned privilege operates. If what we're asking you to acknowledge and give up is privilege that you've gotten just on the face of who you were born into, that's unearned. And so to share that, or to equitably distribute that across your community, across your workplace, actually is the abundant thing to do. The cost of not doing that is much deeper and higher than the cost of doing it. And that framework isn't what translates to most folks. If you're bringing on board more people of color, more women into positions of authority and power, oftentimes folks are, well, then what's going to happen to me? Where do I go? How do I fit into this picture? And what I think happens is what's overlaid on that is how other folks have been traditionally excluded, that they're not part of the picture. So it's hard for them to see themselves as part of a multiracial, multi-generational workplace or business that equitably distributes power and decision-making in such a way that everybody has a voice. That's not a practice that we come into the world experiencing. It's one of which we have to create. and it's new terrain and new ground that many of us are not practicing.
Yeah. And so what's required is a level of humility that we perhaps haven't experienced before in making mistakes and trying to find our way.
And I think that's particularly challenging and difficult for folks who have always been in a position of authority where they confuse leadership with having all the answers. And in this moment, when there aren't new forms that we practice at scale, so folks don't have that experience. And so for most folks who have misidentified management and leadership or leadership with or authority, not having the answers is very uncomfortable. And then it leads to things like perfectionism. Well, we can't do anything until it can be done exactly right. In this transformative moment we're in, failing is what's needed. We need to try new things, recognize that they probably aren't enough and they aren't going to match the situation. Then we iterate into something new. The willingness to fail is a very vulnerable thing to do, not just privately, but in a group. It's even that much more vulnerable, particularly for folks who aren't accustomed to doing that publicly and in a society that doesn't praise failure, which is one of those things that said you got to hold these realities. I mean, we'll lift someone up. I'll just give you like a really mainstream example, just Benjamin Franklin. How many times did this guy fail at everything before he created half the inventions that he created? People say that as like a footnote to the one success that this person has had. And they praise the one success by naming the failures, but not putting the failures in perspective. It's because this person was really great at failing and learning and iterating that then they were allowed to have the one success.
And all these examples are always white men from another time.
That's right. And I used him exactly for that reason, just to be clear.
Yeah, like I work in the world of leadership and intuition. People love to quote Einstein, that Einstein said something about intuition. And that's the quote. Well, Einstein said it, that we've created this world that revolves around the servant, the rational mind as the servant. And my question to that is always like, do you not realize that maybe there are many other people that are not white men and that are not famous that have also said these kinds of things? And why can't we create a culture where we look to those examples? Why do we have to validate something through the experience of a white man from history?
Yes, I experience that on the day-to-day for sure, just as you do. And we're trying to live into our full humanity. And I think as we're moving forward, we're seeing a lot more examples that are being brought to the forefront that are also being acknowledged as examples to be followed and to be led. And they're looking and feeling very much different from the traditional white male hero. And that is also hard for folks to hold as well. And the reality is that many of us have been holding them for generations. We've been holding that for generations. And it's holding the inability of folks to see that reality, and then also holding that when they're faced with that exact same thing, that the example that's being offered to them doesn't look like what they've traditionally and historically seen, that it's hard for them to lean in on that. And knowing that an individual practice of dealing with those contradictions, of trying to defeat and dismantle white supremacy, is not enough. We actually have to be in community in order to help buttress against the interpersonal, the internalized, and the societal messages that will try to dissuade and knock us off course as we're moving forward to dismantle white supremacy. So I always tell folks, this goes back to, I think, what you're referring to before. There's tons of books out in the market. I don't know if that at some point saying the top 25 books on the New York Times bestseller list were all about racism. I don't know if that's the case right now. And if it is, that's great.
And we don't know how many of them got read. They got
That's
bought.
right. They got bought. Exactly. We don't know how many of them got read. And those reading those books, even if folks did read them, is not enough if they just go and do the same thing that they've been doing before. If they don't actually put themselves into a community of practice that actually interrogates current behavior and invites new behavior and new ways of doing and being. And that's the step that I think that most individual folks continue to fail at to such a degree that then the journey becomes impossible. And I think it's when you're in community and those individual failures are met in a community of support that then you can continue to fail in good ways and see those failures as opportunities to be better and do better. The world that we have right now is not the world any of us are wishing that we have, but it's the one that we have. And so the ability to maintain our revolutionary imagination, our liberatory imagination, and spirit of optimism is key. Holding that this world is what it is right now, and it's not the world that we want, and that we can have all the feels about that, and still at the end of the day move forward in an optimistic way that things can be different and be better, even as we fail constantly to overturn my own sexism, my own heterosexism, my own ableism, knowing that I'll make mistakes. But in those mistakes, the idea is that I'm learning and I'm unlearning at the same time. And I'm sharpening my ability to be in community with folks, to see and understand these systems and these patterns over time, such that I can identify them and then create new ways of being and doing that results in a culture that's different than the one we're trying to step out of. And the one we move into right now, that I'll be part of, that we're living through right now, will not be perfect. And that generations that come after us will iterate on what we've learned and what they've learned from us, and then they will advance on that. Going back to your question about how do we defeat white supremacy, in 2016, when Trump was elected, folks who've been in the movement for some time and recognizing organizing strategies by the right, like the Southern Strategy, 30-year, 40-year strategy to achieve state power, it wasn't necessarily a surprise. Many folks who woke up after the election in 2016, their whole world had collapsed. And folks just experienced something very similar in this most recent election with how the numbers turned out, who voted for Trump and who voted for Biden and Harris.
It feels that many in the States have been in a place that is of frazzled nervous system for a long time now, with so much trauma happening on a daily basis. And then it's within that state that this shift has to happen, which is not the easiest of circumstances. And yet, as you share, this is what we have.
And we're at a moment where we're practicing physical distancing. We're doing something that, from an evolutionary standpoint, is not how humans came up. We came up in communities being very connected to one another. And we're in a moment right now where we're experiencing massive change and massive trauma in isolation. Some of us who are single, or far from their home. Their daily existence is them in their domicile where they live. Maybe they have a pet, maybe they don't. And so their interaction is very limited. And I'm very curious to understand how these, what kind of impact will there be on our neurological behavior and our physiology, on our ability to socialize once we move to a place where physical distancing requirements won't be as stringent and folks will be able to interact with each other with some level of safety and security. And even in naming what's happening right now and the requirements of time, I'm glad we, for the most part, I think collectively moved away from social distancing. I still think that's a terminology that's out there, but just to think what we're trying to do. We're not trying to stop from socializing. You and I are thousands of miles apart in different time zones, and we're having a very social engagement right now, but we're physically not together. And even if you were next door to me, we most likely would still have a certain level of distance between us. And so just being able to recognize what it is that we're doing, I think has some real impact on our ability to navigate these turbulent times. And what I was saying before was in 2016 and 2020, I think some folks were still surprised by what happened. Folks in the US were still surprised that, a majority, almost a near majority of the electorate could still vote for Trump and his decisions. That some folks in the exit polls would say, well, yeah, I understand that he has these beliefs, but I'm still going to vote for him anyway. That was very hard, particularly for white folks, to recognize that the majority of the electorate that was white voted for this. It was in 2016 where it was, let's give them a chance, we're not sure. We'd had 4 years of practices, and not just by him. We had 4 years of seeing this crescendo into 2020. And given all of that, folks made a conscious decision to vote the way they voted. And that was destabilizing for many people. And again, I say we have to co-hold those realities. And that's a difficult thing for folks to hold, knowing that folks are consciously choosing to lean in on white supremacy for a number of reasons. But they're choosing to do that. Whereas I think for some people, that's a really hard reality to bear, that if we just know that this is harming people, people won't do it. And that, again, goes to prove the individualized nature of how this problem, how white supremacy and racism gets framed. No, this isn't just about individuals. This is about a whole system that seeks to prioritize one racial grouping over others to such a degree that their economic, cultural, social benefits, folks recognizing those benefits are willingly able to put up with some things to get access to those benefits. And I think that's a hard reality for some folks to recognize.
Yeah. And it brings me to this relationship with certainty that is another aspect of white supremacy, and how this old style of leadership is all about creating certainty and, similar to having the answers, but also to creating trust through a sense of certainty. And that's reflected in the politics, right? Where there's that fear, if someone is like, I know, and this is, that strength of certainty, even though we might know it's completely not true, still has an impact on that part of us, which actually kind of wants it to be that simple. This move out of white supremacy is a big ask because it asks us to really embrace complexity. It asks us to come to terms with the uncertainty that was there anyway, but that we can't pretend that oh yeah, this is what's going to solve this problem, that we have to dig deeper in ourselves and in our communities.
That's right. I think that's playing on the idea of certainty is traditionally what folks feel comfortable with, because that's what we've been given as a model of leadership, as you said. In this new moving forward, we don't think about just one leader. We think about leaderful teams. We think about leaderful organizations. We think about leaderful communities where there are many leaders across the board, and no one person is in a position to know the answers to everything. The best leaders are those folks who can work with and collaborate with others to co-create the way forward, which again, shared power has not been a model of traditional leadership. And so that's also a framework that's going to take some trying and failing and living into before the full confidence in that way of doing and being will be realized. And who will be leading will be different. We're looking at a time where gender is being scrutinized and recognized as a modality in which power has been inequitably given and distributed. And seeing the results of that hasn't made for room for folks who do not fall into that category. And many of the most successful organizations or movements are being led in ways in which fly in the face of that. And how do we honor and pay homage to the reality that that's always been the case, that's not new. These leaders have always been there. It's just that because of patriarchy, those voices have been silenced. It's because of heterosexism that those voices have been silenced. Not completely in a Western sense. In other societies around the world, different genders, different age, different leadership styles have been honored. And I don't want to centralize any particular culture or practice, but we know that Western societies imposed a lot of binary thinking. And it's that binary thinking of either or that we've actually got to live out of, to be both and plus.
Hello. We're taking a short pause from the conversation. On behalf of our team and our community, thank you for being here and co-creating The Future is Beautiful. Much dedication, love, and time goes into the production of this show. We believe in being advertising free in a world that's always trying to sell us stuff we don't need. And so we make this show with you and for you, thanks to your support. There are 3 ways you can be more involved, so we can share the vision, wisdom, and creativity here as we explore what it means to be a human in this time. You can support the podcast by sharing it with your friends, posting episodes on social media, and doing iTunes reviews. You can support as a patron by making a monthly or one-off donation of your choice. And with this, you join the Global Patrons group and monthly video calls where we share connection and insight. You get to know the other amazing patrons from around the world, their stories and their work, and you offer direct support to me and the team, as well as being brought into the behind the scenes of creating something like this. It sounds like a lot, but it's as much or as little as you want to get involved in. You can become a member of Presence, our membership collective of care and practice, where we explore how to embody the themes of the podcast with workshops, calls, special events, tree whispers, and powerful tools, practices, and rituals that you can bring into your life. This is open to absolutely everybody as we create an inclusive and diverse space that celebrates well-being as a human right, where we explore together what it means to be creative, courageous, and connected to ourselves, each other, and the earth. This is about embodying sacred activism. We love meeting patrons and Presence members and how being part in this way weaves our lives together, as well as making this show possible. If anything from this conversation has moved or inspired you, please get more involved. All information can be found at www.thefutureisbeautiful.co/community. This show really can't go on without your patronage and Presence membership, so please do make it happen. And now, back to the conversation. I know that you really live in community. How has that been during this year with the physical distancing?
I've been very much engaged in trying to study and understand intentional communities as a model to practice and live into, a model to practice things like self-governance, participatory democracy, and these different leadership models and styles. We don't live in the traditional intentional community per se. Our community is a bit dispersed. That's based around our practice of homeschooling in our community. There are families that we homeschool with, that we share things with. We share tools, we share resources, we share childcare with. Of course, we share education with. And then what I mean by traditional intentional community, where everyone's on one piece of land and everyone's either co-housing or on a piece of land with multiple houses when they're sharing a number of things, from grocery shopping to gardening to childcare to cooking. Given the price and access to land is highly expensive and restrictive in some ways, more ways in other areas, we have a distributed intentional community made up of families who we have higher levels of alignment with in terms of how we raise our kids, in terms of how we eat, in terms of our political views. And that over a number of years has shifted depending on who comes in and out of that community. I would say that that's been a huge benefit in this time, because the bonds were there much deeper. There was a less feeling of we're in this all alone, that we knew that there are folks who we could still depend on and relate to in deeper ways, that we'd leaned in on and gotten support from in less stressful times than these. In that we'd had some practice of trying and failing these deeper ways of relating to each other in a society that doesn't necessarily allow for that to take place normally. So when COVID hit, we found ourselves already having built some muscle at relating to each other in times of stress and need. And so it's been very helpful in terms of being able to still be in relationship with folks in deeper ways of being in pods and maintaining in-person education activities with our children, knowing that if something were to happen with someone, that we were able to respond. One family in our extended community, husband went into the hospital right away. There was a meal train. People had signed up to provide meals to the family so that they could really focus on sending their energy towards his recovery. If someone needs a tool, for example, no one has to go down to Home Depot and buy it. They put out a call, and maybe someone has that chainsaw that you need. Maybe someone has that skill saw. Maybe someone has those half a dozen eggs you need to to break your bed. So all of those things create a certain level of interdependence in a society that's really oftentimes makes you think the only way to be free and to have exercise freedom or to exercise choices by being an individual and being self-sufficient in that way. And we actually need to move away from that idea, I believe, that we need to go to a much more interdependent way of thinking, that I can't actually survive this on my own. And even if I could, my life is less than because I'm not in a community with others, whereas my concerns are different when I'm in a community with like-minded individuals.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the great fractures in our society, that the privilege actually creates more isolation. And then you get into a state where you don't need to communicate with anyone else because you have everything that you need. And for many people during this year, like, that has been the situation where privilege has kept people safe from COVID, but also really isolated. And then in different social economic backgrounds where that interdependence is wired in, not in the intentional way that you're speaking about, but in a different way, we've also seen much higher COVID rates. And also, it hasn't been a time of isolation because there has had to be support and sharing in different ways.
And that's really unfortunate because of the economic ramifications of shutting down, slowing down. It's meant that many folks are now without employment, and there's been not adequate governmental support of that. And you're finding folks having to consolidate households, and that, as you said, is creating some interesting dynamics and unfortunate transmission rates for some families who don't have the resources to necessarily. They're having to, in those households, having to expose themselves to go out to work in various capacities, and then coming home and transmission rates are happening. And so we're looking in society and thinking about, why am I searching for the term? Essential workers, and how essential workers right now are, again, being viewed as disposable, that we're in a place where there's not a want for a bullet or for a bomb, but there's a want for masks and gloves and PPE to protect those who are out on the front lines, who are delivering life-giving services and providing food and medical care, who are continuing to keep the society moving.
And also, can we add to that, indulgent Amazon orders?
For sure.
Yeah, things that aren't essential but have been deemed essential during this time.
That's right. And at a time of people spending more and more time at home, we're finding that home is not a safe place for everyone. And it's creating more opportunities for abuse to happen, for folks who are caught in relationships that aren't necessarily that safe for them to be subject to more of that. And so we've got a number of things that this situation is highlighting and raising to the fore for us as a society to think about, that the number of difficulties experienced are exponential depending on where you find yourself placed within society.
We talk about it sometimes, as like statistics and systems. It's a lot of human beings that are in deep struggle. And the politics here in the UK this year has been making that divide bigger.
Yes, one would think something like this would be an equalizer along those fronts, but it's actually exacerbating the inequality that already existed. That the gap, and you mentioned Amazon, for example, and holding the reality that in the pandemic, that everyone's home and things are slowing down and grinding to a halt for many folks, that they, as an institution, are growing and profiting by leaps and bounds on one hand, and on the other hand, there are whole communities that are being significantly impacted by this. And that we have, the exercise of individual rights and this question of masking or not masking is also a huge issue. Knowing that with climate change, it impacts the most vulnerable who are already subject to many, many already environmental negative impacts are yet again at the top of the line for highest risk here. So because wearing a mask again is not just for my own protection, it's for the protection of those who I come into contact with. My decision not to do that has some significant impacts on folks who are already at high risk. For me to you, the individual chauvinism and privilege, it's in alignment with how we've evolved as a country, that the individual right over the collective good, where at the same time we could say all men are created equal, let alone that there were women at the time as well, but not seen, not valued. And there were other people, indigenous and folks of African descent here, not seen as humans, go over that collective right. That dependence on tradition has gotten us to a lot of the place where we are right now. And we see that playing out in this spike we're currently in right now, where it's still, like climate, being debated as whether or not it's real or not. Even though the president himself has contracted it, there's still a debate on whether or not it's real. And the fact that not all folks will have had the access to remedies as those who are promoting the denial and the lack of seriousness around this, it still allows for folks to buy into their own demise.
It feels like climate has taken a back seat in all of this year as well. I wonder what your perception is on that.
I would agree that it has taken a backseat to it. Let me just go on a train of thought for you for a second.
Boarding the train, Hop.
Yeah. And when I think about what you said, I think about what I said earlier about co-holding some realities. It is because the globalized nature of the way in which we live has allowed for this pandemic to grow exponentially in the way in which it has. Whereas if we were in a different time, the transmission, the exposure, the movement of the virus from one country to the next would have been at a much slower pace. And how I feel like climate is at the forefront of this in a way, and clearly, like I said, we're taking a train ride, is the transmission rate to go from one place to the next is enabled by our ability to travel globally. And that ability to travel globally is predicated on fossil fuels. And when I think about what we've been able to do based on the exploitation of people and the extraction of fossil fuels to create conditions conducive that someone in one country could have something, get on a plane and go to another country and be the vector for transmission, is one way in which I think about how climate impacts that. And when I think about the way in which climate still plays out, is the forest fires are still happening. People are in a time of a pandemic. Myself, we were forced to evacuate due to smoke and the proximity of the fire during the time of a pandemic. We evacuated to friends and relatives' homes in a time of crisis where normally you'd want to be very close to folks, and we're still having to maintain a certain level of distance. I think about climate being in the backdrop of everything that is happening right now. So when we think about climate taking a back seat, I think about all the other contingencies that need to be made for environmental disasters like floods, like fires, and what are the conditions that then we have to take in order to protect ourselves additionally within the context of COVID. I was trying to just have a real conversation. I wasn't trying to bring facts and figures. I was really trying to bring just more of my own, gut and visceral reaction to it. And sometimes when we have these kind of conversations in settings like this, you feel like it goes back again to that level of perfectionism, that one has to come off or sound like an expert, that one has to deliver the perfect line. I think in a conversation interaction like this, and I think in day to day, those aren't the most helpful ways to show up. Sometimes it's just helpful to show up in the way you show up. And I'll just say this, I really appreciate your flexibility because this is the second showing up. And just owning that when we connected the first time, Well, actually, this is, I think, our third attempt,
I
maybe
think
our
it's our
fourth
fourth
attempt.
date.
Our
Yeah.
fourth attempt. Yes, that's
Yeah.
right. One, just scheduling. Two, I was evacuating because of the Bobcat fire. Three, I was just having one heck of a week, and I was just spent emotionally, spiritually, and it was just not a good time for me to be in community to talk about the things that we were set to talk about, which was could have been anything. And being able to be in enough community with you and myself to know that we needed to move to a different time and space was really gratifying. And I feel really grateful for that. And I think that's something I've tried to hold in this moment of contradictions is none of this is normal. And I think the world in some ways, and when you ask how, what's it like relating to humans and the planet this time, is that there are many signals saying none of this is normal. Yet at the same time, we recognize that there is this drive to normalcy. Is to actually normalize all of what's happening, and that the things that you're experiencing and feeling, you might should feel some way about it in such a way that you feel bad about feeling less good or less capable. And I always have to remember we're being asked to be normal in very unnormal times.
And I feel like this is the contradiction of this time that I feel is deeply harmful, because there are so many people talking about what this time is and the things that we've been talking about today, and really struggle to embody it. I'm doing my small bit, and within that, in my small bit, I'm like, okay, this particular podcast had to happen this month for various reasons to do with a collaboration and funding specifications. But it could only happen in a moment that both of us were available. And I don't mean available as in like time in a diary. I mean like available. And when we met on Friday to talk and you weren't feeling available, I wasn't either. I was also having a spiritual, emotional process that meant that I wasn't really in a space where I could fully listen. And I really live with that trust. And it's really hard to undo that particular function of white supremacy. But it says that this is what's happening. So
That's
this
right.
is what's happening.
This is what's happening. So it's what's happening. Get over it. Get through it. Let's do it. And it has taken some time to come to that place. And I've had to remind myself and my community and colleagues and coworkers of that very same thing. Look, whatever was before is not what's going to be after. And we should not pretend that we can move in the way in which we moved before. There are so many things that are happening behind. I mean, we're all working from home if we're lucky. Those of us who aren't lucky are out on the front lines of working in the middle of all of this. That also has to be a consideration. And for many households, there are some people that are working home, some people that are not even working. And there are a number of different realities overlapping. When folks show up to your Zoom at 9 a.m. or whatever time for work, we ought to give ourselves and each other enough grace to be open to the fact that we have no idea what it took for them to show up in that moment. But we know it wasn't like it was before. And I think that's part of how I was talking about of trying to be conscious of, I'm not sure how you showed up today, but I can only imagine what you are holding to be here and to be present with me. And I take it as an honor and a privilege. For the time that we're going to be together, I'm going to try to be as present as I possibly can. And when I can't be, I'm going to be honest with you about it. Because reality is, even if I don't tell you, you're going to be able to perceive, man, this brother, he's not even here right now. Words are coming out of his mouth, but I have no idea. I have no idea where this person is.
Yeah. And it's, for me, this whole experience, for example, with our scheduling, a few years ago, it would have infuriated me. I would have been like, this person's messing me around. This person's not serious. All these like stories, right? I need it certain. And I don't operate in that way now. And that's taken a big process of unlearning.
Oh, yeah.
And apart from having to say, like, what's the reality of this being able to happen this year because of this particular requirement that I couldn't move around, I felt, relaxed. And actually, every time there was something, my compassion opened rather than my frustration. And I started to feel into that question of what's it like to be Hop right now? Like, what is Hop holding? And so within that process of this taking more time, I have felt that there's been a process of us connecting deeper through that.
That's right.
And I know that both of us are in caregiving situations at the moment. And that is a whole other
oh my goodness.
thing. that deepens compassion and patience and enforces us to really embody these things that we talk about here.
Yes, that's right. And caregiving for elders, to be specific. And that has a whole emotional and spiritual toll, because these are folks that you've seen in their prime, and you've seen and you've related to them in very different contexts. And now they're limited in they have different, let me just say this, they have different capacities. That is their reality now. And more of their world depends on us being there to help buttress and support them in places where I still have to, on the day-to-day, have a moment of, wow, I'm feeding this person. And I'm having this dual experience of reliving moments where they were providing similar support and care for me or for my children. And now they're in a capacity where that's just not their reality right now. Your compassion completely opens up, and it's challenging. And it's completely challenging.
Yeah, and it brings us to that place where you began, which is the listening to what's in our body. Like, what is happening is what's happening here in my body, mind, in your body, mind, and not what was said was going to be
That's
happening, right, or what we need to pretend is happening. And the more real we can get, the more chance we have.
That's right. And I think that's also being real about the moment we're in, is just in terms of calendars and diaries and schedules. Is it realistic to think that things are just going to go off without a hitch under these current conditions? And to have that expectation is to really set oneself up and others around you for a very unpleasant experience. There are still the framework to be overlaid upon us that that's what we should expect. No, things are going to happen just the way they happen because they said they're going to happen. And to step outside of that is a very helpful practice. Because as you said, if this had happened sometime in the not so distant past,
if we'd forced it.
Yeah, well, if we had forced it, and the narrative that we create around why is this the fourth time we're having this? Is it even worth it? Who is this person? Versus, oh man, they've gone through some things. Even if we hadn't had some of the similarities in the way we've had to show up and what we're carrying right now, I think it still would have allowed for us to have a much expansive opportunity for compassion and empathy for our situation. To know that that's been a change that I hope we can move forward with in a larger context would be a helpful evolutionary process that this experience has helped us develop into.
Yeah, because this experience in this micro is resonant of this time and the macro experience, the collective experience. How we show up in the small opportunities to embody and create these changes, these shifts in perception and ways of being in the world. That's how it happens on the bigger scale. There is that. It's not all about the individual, and yet what you do does matter.
That's right. And I mentioned the movement for Black Lives. In the moment of pandemic, you've seen some of the largest demonstrations in the history of the United States and the largest global demonstrations around one topic, where at one point, I think there were marches happening on one weekend in the US and 9 or 10 other countries around the world. Folks who are actually putting their individual selves and willing to expose themselves to COVID to go out to make a stand for the rights of Black people. That's huge. That sent signals. And now we see in European countries in other countries around the world, where violence against folks who are Black in those countries are rising up to say, hey, our lives matter. That resonance and that solidarity speaks volumes. That carrying over and throughout this crisis and beyond it is a step in the direction of ending white supremacy globally. I mean, clearly, marching is one method of making change, and it's not enough on its own. But to realize that folks are making that calculation in this time to go out and be in solidarity with folks whom they do not know, particularly for folks who aren't racialized as Black in this country and around the world, to show solidarity is a massive step. That we were not able to get to those numbers and the size and that scale previously. It's taken some engagement in the narrative space for folks to be able to move beyond the books, to get to the practice of actually trying to understand what it means to be an ally, what it means to be a co-conspirator, and what it means to move from charity to solidarity with folks. And that's what we do after the march that matters. Are people organizing themselves into forms of organization that will help move them deeper into their anti-racist practice? Are people showing up for racial justice groups? Are people moving for Black Lives groups? Are people being able to onboard into their local Moving for Black Lives or Black Lives Matters chapter? Are folks who are BIPOC, folks who are not Black, organizing in their racial identity groups to understand anti-Blackness and to defeat it, and not to be used as a wedge by white supremacy against the organizing efforts of Black folks? These are all the things that are possibilities that ought to be happening and are happening around the world in the US in order to help advance.
Yeah, so it's more than a dumpster fire.
Exactly. And I was being kind of funny with a friend of mine showed me a bumper sticker the other day, and it said 2020 was written, it was on top of a dumpster. And it has been one heck of a year. And from my perspective, 2020 is going to pale in comparison to what 2021 has to bring forth, because everything's going to be different from here on out. And it's going to invite us into new ways of being and doing that we have no experience in or little experience. And we're going to need to chart a pathway forward using our liberatory imagination in order to craft new governance models, new economic models, new models of community support. And we'll be asked to scale them beyond just our little pod to our community, to our city, to our county, to our state, to our country. And I think it's a moment of, just as in some ways it's been restrictive in terms of our physical gathering, I think it's been exponential in examples where folks have come together to create some alternatives. And that's been really refreshing. The mutual aid that I've seen happen in the US and globally has been wonderful to see. And to be able to then scale that and to internalize some of those practices into our organizations, into our homes, into our communities, that's what this moment's inviting us to. As for many folks, our very survival is on the line.
Thank you, Hop. The train has arrived into the station.
Hopefully, it's where you wanted to end up. Or somewhere
it's
close.
Where I am, and I will.
I'm going to take that in the best possible way.
Yeah, no, I'm just going to get off the train and see what's here, right? I didn't have a clear destination in mind. So
well, then I was a good training companion.
Absolutely.
I wasn't sure where we were going to go. Yeah, this has been wonderful. Thank you,
Hop. I really appreciate everything that you've shared today. How can our friends listening connect deeper with you from here if they want to ride to another station
to ride the train,
with you?
Ride to another destination? Right on. Well, they can see some of the writings I've done for Sierra Club at sierraclub.org/Sierra. That's sierraclub.org/Sierra. You can also follow me on Instagram if they like. I'm not on Twitter. I am on Twitter, but I don't really do much with Twitter at this point in time. And I'm on Facebook. They can find me at Hop Hopkins. They can look me up there. And then there are some other articles I've written on spaces like Medium. They can do a Google search for my name and they can find me that way. Or they could find me in your diary postponing meetings.
Well, they would have to get in the train and reverse.
Right on.
For that.
That's right. That was past practice.
Hop, it's been a real pleasure. I've been very moved by this conversation and deeply appreciate who you are and what you're exploring in this world.
Yeah. Well, I very much appreciate the work you do and very honored to be a guest here today and look forward to future collaborations. And one day I'll be in the UK, hopefully, and we will take a real train ride.
Okay.
Yes,
I'm in.
There we go. All right. There we go.
Thank you for spending your precious time with us. As always, you can find links to everything we mentioned in this episode, download our book, and discover so much more over on the blog. We don't believe in selling you things you don't need through this podcast, and so it's made possible with you, our community. If you loved this and would like to fund our show with a monthly donation or join our online group to connect with other listeners, please visit www.thefutureisbeautiful.co and click on Community and Support. Please also share with friends, hit subscribe, and leave us a review so we can grow. Those gold stars really help others find us, so these ideas can spread. Here is to us, creating a beautiful future together. The Future is Beautiful is made by an all-female team working voluntarily or on reduced rates until our listener support grows. If you have been moved by anything you heard here, please donate the equivalent of buying us a drink. All donations make a huge difference to us and will allow us to keep doing this and remain advertising free. Until next time, I leave you with this question. How will you create beauty in the world?